The new discoveries here at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre happened during a recent restoration around the tomb of Jesus.
Deep beneath one of Christianity's holiest sites, beneath marble that hasn't been moved in centuries, beneath layers of history that span 2 millennia, scientists have uncovered something extraordinary. For nearly 2,000 years, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem has stood as a monument to faith. Millions of pilgrims have walked its ancient floors, touched its sacred stones, and prayed at the site believed to hold the tomb where Jesus Christ was laid after crucifixion. But what lies beneath those floors, beneath the marble, beneath the centuries of reconstruction and devotion, has remained hidden. Sealed, untouched by modern investigation. Until now. When structural engineers noticed cracks forming in the floor surrounding the edicule, the small shrine enclosing the traditional burial site, they had no choice but to investigate. What began as a routine stability check became one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem's history. As researchers carefully removed layers that hadn't been disturbed since the 16th century, they found far more than ancient stone. What emerged from beneath the marble didn't just confirm historical accounts. It challenged them, it expanded them, and in some cases, it rewrote what scholars thought they knew about this sacred ground. Layer by layer, the team uncovered evidence that stunned even veteran archaeologists. A garden preserved beneath the church floor, tomb structures matching biblical descriptions with precision, physical evidence of burial practices described in the Gospels, and finally, a sealed chamber that no one knew existed, untouched for nearly 2,000 years. The discoveries raise profound questions. Questions about history, about faith, about what we can truly know of events that shaped civilization. And questions about what else might be hidden beneath sites we've revered but never fully examined. This is the story of what scientists found when they finally looked beneath Jesus's tomb. Not speculation, not tradition, but physical evidence documented, measured, and impossible to ignore. The decision that changed everything. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre operates under one of the most complex administrative arrangements in the world. 3 Christian denominations, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Armenian Apostolic, share custody of the site under an agreement called the status quo, established in 1852. This arrangement means that nothing can be changed, moved, or modified without unanimous consent from all 3 groups. Not a candle, not a stone, not a single tile. For generations, this created a kind of protective paralysis. The site remained largely untouched, which preserved it but also prevented any serious investigation of what lay beneath the surface. By 2016, that careful equilibrium faced a crisis. Structural engineers conducting routine inspections noticed subtle but alarming shifts in the marble flooring surrounding the edicule. The small shrine, rebuilt in 1810 after a fire, had been shored up with steel supports since the British Mandate period. But those supports were failing. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that sections of the floor were sinking, not dramatically, but measurably. The marble rested on compacted fill that had settled over centuries, and in some areas, voids had formed beneath the surface. The engineers delivered a stark warning. Without intervention, the structural integrity of one of Christianity's holiest sites could be compromised irreversibly. This forced the hands of the church custodians. For perhaps the first time in modern history, the 3 denominations agreed. Scientific access would be granted, but under strict conditions. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, the Roman Catholic custody of the Holy Land, and the Armenian Apostolic Patriarchate each assigned representatives to monitor every action. The team would work under constant supervision. They would be allowed to examine only areas directly related to structural stability. And they would have a narrow window of time. In October 2016, a team from the National Technical University of Athens arrived in Jerusalem. They were joined by archaeologists, conservators, and specialists in ancient construction. Their stated mission was to stabilize the edicule and assess the condition of the foundations. But everyone involved understood the deeper significance. For the first time in centuries, modern science would be allowed to examine the ground beneath the traditional tomb of Jesus Christ. The atmosphere inside the church shifted immediately. Technicians set up equipment in silence, fully aware they were entering a space sealed to outsiders for generations. Pilgrims watched from a distance as barriers went up and work began. On the night of October 26, 2016, the team began removing the marble cladding that had covered the burial bed since at least 1555. No one knew what condition the stone beneath would be in, or if it would even still exist. As the first marble slab lifted away, the team braced themselves for disappointment. Centuries of destruction, reconstruction, and modification had transformed the church repeatedly. Many scholars assumed the original limestone burial bed had been lost long ago, ground away by time and human hands. What they found instead stopped everyone in their tracks. The limestone that refused to disappear. Beneath the marble, there was fill material, mortar and rubble from past restorations. The team worked carefully, documenting every layer, expecting nothing more than construction debris. Then, just before the tomb was scheduled to be resealed on October 28, they uncovered another slab. This one was different. Etched faintly into its surface was a cross. The team's pace slowed. This wasn't modern material. This was something older, something that had been deliberately placed. As they carefully removed this layer, light fell on what lay beneath. Limestone. Original, intact limestone. The burial bed that scholars thought had been destroyed or eroded away was still there. After fires, earthquakes, demolitions, and nearly 2,000 years of human activity, the stone where tradition says Jesus' body was laid remained. "I'm absolutely amazed," said Frederick Hebert, National Geographic's archaeologist in residence, his voice barely steady. "My knees are shaking a little bit because I wasn't expecting this." The limestone surface was worn smooth in places, evidence of centuries of touch before it was sealed beneath marble. But it was unmistakably intact. Measurements confirmed it matched the dimensions and characteristics of first-century Jewish burial beds found in other tombs around Jerusalem. The team worked through the night, documenting every detail. They took high-resolution photographs from multiple angles. They mapped the surface contours with laser scanning equipment. They measured tool marks left by whoever had carved the stone nearly 2,000 years earlier. Before the marble was replaced, they cut a small window into the southern wall of the edicule. Through this opening, visitors can now see a portion of the original cave wall, the actual rock face that had been hidden behind 19th-century cladding. "This is the holy rock that has been revered for centuries," explained Professor Antonia Moropoulou, chief scientific supervisor of the restoration, "but only now can it actually be seen." The discovery settled one crucial question. The location of the tomb had not shifted through centuries of reconstruction. Despite everything the site had endured, the original burial place remained where tradition had always claimed it to be. But this was only the beginning, because once the team confirmed the burial bed was intact, they received authorization to investigate deeper, to examine the layers beneath the visible floor, to understand the full history of this ground. What they found there would prove even more remarkable. Descending through 2,000 years, with permission to examine the structural foundations, the archaeological team began a careful excavation of the floor surrounding the edicule. They weren't looking for artifacts or treasures. They were documenting stratigraphy, the layered history written in soil and stone. What emerged was a clear timeline, readable in the earth itself. The topmost layer was immediately recognizable, 20th-century leveling mortar. This material had been used during restoration work following damage from various conflicts and natural deterioration. It was recent, practical, and expected. Beneath it, the team uncovered fragments of Byzantine paving stones. These dated to the 4th century, from the church built under Emperor Constantine's orders. The stones confirmed that a formal sanctuary had stood here long before medieval builders arrived, exactly as historical records described. The next layer carried darker history, dense, uniform rubble associated with a 2nd-century Roman construction project. According to historical sources, Emperor Hadrian had deliberately built a temple to Venus over Christian holy sites, attempting to erase them from memory. The fill was compacted and deliberately placed, showing that earlier structures had been intentionally destroyed and covered. For researchers, this matched written accounts, but it also meant that Hadrian's act of suppression had inadvertently preserved what lay beneath by sealing it under tons of stone and earth. Then came the surprise. Below the Roman destruction layer, the soil changed character completely. No more construction debris, no more fill material. What appeared instead was fine limestone dust, stone chips, and packing sediment, quarry material. The team had reached a layer that predated all the religious structures. This was Jerusalem as it existed in the 1st century CE, an active, industrial zone where workers cut limestone blocks for construction throughout the city. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the finding. The subsurface showed slopes and cuts consistent with quarry operations documented elsewhere in ancient Jerusalem. The pattern was unmistakable: deliberate stone removal, not natural erosion. Several pottery fragments found in this layer were analyzed. The forms and firing techniques dated them to before 70 CE, before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem's Second Temple. This was crucial evidence. It meant that the area beneath the church had once been exactly what early Christian sources claimed: a quarry outside Jerusalem's walls, later abandoned and used for burial purposes. Jewish law forbade burials within city limits. Bodies had to be interred outside the walls to keep the sacred city ritually clean. The Gospels specifically state that Jesus was crucified and buried outside the city gates. The quarry layer proved this location had indeed been outside the ancient walls. At the time of Jesus' death, this area was beyond Jerusalem's boundaries, exactly where a crucifixion site and nearby tomb would have been located according to religious law. But the team's most astonishing discovery still lay below the quarry material. In a layer that should have contained nothing but ancient dust and stone, they found something that shouldn't exist: evidence of life. The garden that waited in darkness. When the team reached the layer beneath the Roman rubble and quarry dust, they expected bedrock, solid limestone, scarred by ancient tools, but essentially dead stone. What they uncovered instead was soil, dark, organic, enriched earth that looked nothing like quarry debris. The texture was wrong. The color was wrong. This wasn't fill material or construction waste. This was garden soil, deliberately placed in a location where nothing would naturally grow. The first analysis came back with results that made the entire team pause. Pollen. Preserved pollen grains trapped in the soil for nearly 2,000 years. And not just any pollen, specific species that told a precise story. Olive pollen, grape pollen, the signature plants of cultivated gardens in 1st century Jerusalem. These weren't wild species. They were domesticated varieties, the same plants that households commonly grew in managed garden plots. According to the botanical specialists, this represented an active, maintained garden space, not abandoned land. The significance hit immediately. The Gospel of John states explicitly, "At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid." For centuries, scholars debated whether garden was literal or symbolic. Gardens appear throughout Scripture as metaphors for paradise, for new life, for spiritual renewal. Many assumed John was using poetic language, not describing actual geography. The pollen proved otherwise. This wasn't metaphor, it was memory of a real place. As excavation continued, more evidence emerged. When the soil was carefully removed, the bedrock beneath revealed shallow depressions carved into the limestone, not natural erosion, intentional cuts. Plant beds, small, organized plots arranged in a deliberate pattern. These matched the layout of garden spaces often found near 1st century Jewish tombs. Families would plant and maintain these areas as part of honoring their dead, tending flowers or useful plants during visits to burial sites. The discovery shifted everything. This wasn't just land that happened to be near a tomb. It was an integrated burial garden, a managed space connected to the tomb itself. According to preliminary analysis, someone had cared for this garden regularly. The soil composition showed repeated cultivation, not a single planting. The beds showed maintenance, shaping, attention over time. And then the team found what lay beneath the garden beds, cut into the bedrock, hidden under the cultivated soil, sealed by nearly 2 millennia of history. The tomb itself. The burial chamber that matched the story. The first surface to emerge from beneath the garden soil was flat and precisely shaped. Not a natural depression, not a rough quarry cut. A carved ledge with clean edges and a carefully smoothed top. A burial bench. Several archaeologists stepped forward simultaneously. They recognized it instantly. This was a 1st century Jewish burial bench, identical to hundreds catalogued in tombs throughout Jerusalem from that period. In 1st century burial practice, benches served a specific ritual purpose. After death, the body was laid on the bench for preparation, washing, anointing with oils and spices, wrapping in linen. The bench height, surface finish, and overall form followed strict cultural patterns. This bench matched those patterns precisely. Its height was consistent with other documented examples. The surface showed controlled chisel work, not rough cutting. Tool marks moved in rhythmic arcs characteristic of trained stone carvers. As the excavation widened, a second bench appeared, then a third. All three showed the same craftsmanship, the same careful attention to detail. The presence of multiple benches indicated something important. This wasn't a single burial space hastily carved for one person. It was a family tomb, designed to accommodate several bodies over time. According to the Gospels, Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Jewish council. The quality of workmanship visible in these benches matched what would be expected from a tomb belonging to someone of means and status. Then came another discovery. Clearing rubble from the eastern wall, the team uncovered a narrow vertical opening. At first, it appeared small, possibly insignificant, but as loose stone was removed, the feature became unmistakable. A coke, a burial niche cut deep into the bedrock. These niches served a specific purpose in Jewish burial practice. After the body had rested on the preparation bench for approximately a year, allowing soft tissue to decompose, family members would collect the bones and place them either in an ossuary or in a coke for permanent interment. The presence of both benches and a coke confirmed this was a complete, functioning burial complex, not a partial structure, not an unfinished project, a tomb designed and used according to first-century Jewish custom. Conservators examined the chisel marks carefully. The strikes showed consistent pressure and angle, the signature of experienced stoneworkers. They looked for evidence of later modification or medieval reworking. None appeared. These surfaces were original, untouched since they were carved nearly 2,000 years ago. One detail stood out as particularly intriguing. On the western wall, another niche had been started but never completed. The carving stopped abruptly, halfway through the cut. Some researchers believe this incomplete work might indicate sudden urgency, perhaps a burial that needed to happen faster than originally planned. Others suggest it simply reflects normal work stoppage for reasons now lost to history. The speculation remains just that, but the incomplete niche adds to the impression of a tomb prepared and used during a compressed timeline, consistent with the Gospel accounts of Jesus' burial happening quickly before the Sabbath began. By this point, the excavation had revealed a complete first-century Jewish burial complex, exactly matching the type of tomb described in Scripture. The garden above hadn't been symbolic decoration. It had been part of a real burial site, maintained by real people following real customs. But the most extraordinary discovery was yet to come, because hidden within the tomb chamber itself were traces that should not have survived, traces that would prove the space had actually been used. The fibers that shouldn't exist. With the tomb structure fully documented, the next step was to examine the chamber floor and the narrow crevices between stones. The tomb had been sealed beneath centuries of construction, but the chances of organic material surviving seemed vanishingly small. Even so, the team prepared micro-extraction equipment. They wanted to be thorough, to ensure nothing was overlooked. The first unusual finding appeared when a narrow groove between two benches was carefully vacuumed with specialized tools. At the bottom of the groove, trapped against the stone, was a cluster of tiny fibers. They were faint, nearly invisible, but they had a texture that didn't match mineral dust or environmental debris. When transferred to a sealed vial, the material didn't crumble like plant matter or sweep away like sand. Under laboratory magnification, the images revealed something remarkable, a weave pattern. The fibers showed the twisted, interlaced structure of textile, not random organic material. According to the technical report, the fibers had characteristics consistent with ancient linen. This created immediate debate within the team. Linen is notoriously fragile. It degrades quickly in open environments, destroyed by moisture, bacteria, and time. Finding intact linen fibers in a chamber this old seemed nearly impossible. The team double-checked their instruments for contamination. The equipment tested clean. They took additional samples from different locations within the tomb. More fibers appeared, similar in size and structure. The consistency suggested these weren't accidental intrusions or modern contamination. Something textile-related had once been present in this space, and traces had survived against all odds. One sample provided even stronger evidence. Embedded within a fiber fragment was microscopic residue showing chemical signatures associated with ancient oils, not modern oils. The breakdown pattern matched aromatic preparations, the kind used in first-century burial ointments. Several researchers cautioned that the findings were preliminary and required further validation. But the evidence was difficult to dismiss. Linen soaked with burial preparations was exactly what Jewish burial custom prescribed, and exactly what the Gospels describe being used to wrap Jesus' body. The implications were profound. The benches had proven the tomb was real. The coke showed it followed established burial practice. But the fibers pushed the investigation beyond architecture into something more personal. They suggested an actual body had been prepared on these stones, that someone had followed the ritual of anointing and wrapping, that this space hadn't just been carved and abandoned, it had been used for its intended purpose. The team proceeded with renewed caution. If textile fragments had survived in the chamber crevices, what else might be preserved, and where would such evidence most likely remain intact? The answer lay in a space that no one knew existed until ground-penetrating radar revealed its outline. The chamber that remained sealed. The burial benches and linen traces were extraordinary findings, but the ground-penetrating radar showed something else, something that changed the entire scope of the investigation. Directly beneath the traditional burial bed, the radar detected a void, a rectangular empty space with clean edges and consistent depth. It appeared deliberately created and completely sealed. The technicians ran the scan multiple times to rule out equipment error or interference. The void appeared again, clearer each time. According to internal notes, the dimensions matched a small room or chamber. Yet no historical document mentioned anything beneath this location. No map showed it. No tradition spoke of it. If a chamber existed here, it had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Because the burial slab couldn't be moved without risking damage to the shrine above, the team searched for alternative access. A natural fissure ran along the bedding stone, a crack just wide enough to guide a fiber optic camera into the opening. The camera descended slowly. The screen showed darkness, then dust, then. The room erupted in whispered exclamations. The chamber was intact, completely intact. The floor was covered in undisturbed sediment. The walls showed no signs of later repairs or intrusion. Nothing inside had been touched since the chamber was sealed. The camera panned slowly across the space. In the center sat a flat limestone bench, carved with the same simple lines found in the upper burial benches. These weren't Christian symbols from later centuries. They matched first-century Jewish preparation spaces precisely. The edges of the bench were sharp rather than worn, suggesting the surface had been used briefly, perhaps only once, then sealed away. Through the small opening, the team extracted trace samples from the bench surface using vacuum equipment. Laboratory analysis identified microscopic fibers consistent with ancient linen, similar to those found in the upper chamber but more concentrated. According to specialists reviewing the data, this pattern suggested a body wrapped in linen had rested on this stone. The claim was made cautiously, with appropriate scientific hedging, but the evidence was clear enough to document formally. A small carved niche in the chamber wall added another detail. It matched the shape of short-term storage spaces used in burial rituals, places where vessels of oil or burial spices might be set during preparation ceremonies. The niche was empty except for a faint patch of discoloration, as if an object had once sat there before the chamber was sealed. Mineral analysis of the walls provided the final confirmation. Geochemical readings showed crust buildup consistent with a closed environment. No cracks, no evidence of later entry, no signs of air circulation or water intrusion. If the analysis was correct, this chamber had been sealed soon after the 1st century and had never been opened since. The implications split the team between cautious interpretation and barely contained excitement. Some argued the chamber fit early descriptions of Jesus' original burial place before later construction altered the site. Others insisted more verification was needed before making any connection to specific historical figures. According to internal accounts that later leaked, debates became heated. A few scholars pointed out that if the chamber truly dated to the 1st century, showed signs of a linen-wrapped body placed briefly then removed, and had remained sealed for 2 millennia, it aligned remarkably with the Gospel timeline. Opponents countered that correlation wasn't identification, that the evidence, however extraordinary, didn't constitute proof of whose body had been placed here. The debate reached an impasse, but word of the sealed chamber's discovery spread beyond the immediate team. And with that, the quiet excavation became something else entirely. 6 points where scripture meets stone. As analysis of the discoveries continued, researchers began compiling what they'd found into a comprehensive picture. 6 distinct lines of evidence emerged, each independently verifiable. each aligning with specific details from the Gospel accounts. First, the location outside the walls. Jewish law strictly forbade burials within Jerusalem's city limits. The dead were considered ritually impure, and the holy city had to be kept clean. The Gospels explicitly state that Jesus was crucified and buried outside the city gates. The excavation proved this location had been outside the ancient walls. The quarry layer confirmed it was an industrial zone in the 1st century, beyond residential areas. Only later did expanded city walls bring the site within Jerusalem's boundaries, exactly as historical sources describe. Second, the garden setting. John chapter 19 verse 41 states, "At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden." The pollen evidence and carved plant beds proved this wasn't poetic language. This was a real, maintained garden with olive trees and grapevines, the exact plants Jesus referenced in his parables. The garden wasn't added later as Christian symbolism. It existed before the tomb was sealed. Third, the tomb of a wealthy man. Matthew chapter 27 verses 57 to 60 identifies Joseph of Arimathea as a rich man who provided his own tomb for Jesus' burial. The quality of stonework in the burial benches confirmed this wasn't a common grave. The precise carving, the multiple chambers, the careful finishing, all indicated a tomb created for someone of means and status, exactly as the Gospels describe. Fourth, carved from rock. Mark chapter 15 verse 46 specifically states the tomb was cut out of rock. The entire complex was hand-carved into solid limestone, not a natural cave modified for use, not a constructed chamber. A tomb deliberately and skillfully cut from living rock by trained craftsmen. Fifth, accessible location for urgent burial. The Gospels indicate Jesus was buried hurriedly before the Sabbath began. There was no time to transport a body to a distant cemetery. The tomb's location just outside the city gate, near the crucifixion site, made it ideal for quick burial. Joseph of Arimathea could reach it rapidly, prepare the body according to custom, and seal it before sunset, exactly as the timeline requires. Sixth, the preservation through destruction. In 135 CE, Emperor Hadrian built a temple to Venus over the site, attempting to erase Christian memory. Ironically, this act of suppression preserved the location. By burying the tomb under massive construction, Hadrian created a time capsule. When Constantine's team excavated the site 200 years later, they found the tomb intact beneath Roman rubble, confirming the location's continuity despite attempts to destroy it. Each piece of evidence stands independently. Each can be verified through standard archaeological methods, but together, they create a compelling picture that matches the gospel narrative with remarkable precision. This doesn't constitute absolute proof of whose body was buried here. Science cannot definitively identify remains from 2,000 years ago without DNA comparison, and there's nothing to compare against. But what the evidence does show is this: the location, the timing, the structure, the burial customs, the garden setting, and even the attempts at erasure all align with what early Christian sources recorded about Jesus' burial. For believers, this provides physical validation of accounts they've accepted on faith. For historians, it demonstrates that gospel writers recorded actual places and practices, not purely symbolic narratives. For skeptics, it presents data that challenges dismissive assumptions. And for archaeology itself, it represents a rare convergence where ancient texts and physical evidence speak the same language. The reactions that shook the field. When news of the sealed chamber reached academic circles, the response was immediate, intense, and divided. Senior archaeologists urged extreme caution. They emphasized that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the chamber, while remarkable, required extensive validation before any historical figures could be associated with it. Dr. Jody McNeice, a leading expert on 1st century Jerusalem, noted, "The presence of other tombs from this period is important archaeological evidence. It shows this area was indeed a Jewish cemetery outside the walls during Jesus' time. But that doesn't prove which specific individuals were buried here." Religious custodians reacted with a different kind of concern. They feared unrestricted access would lead to sensationalism or misinterpretation. Several insisted that only authorized specialists should examine the chamber and demanded limits on public disclosure until proper oversight could be established. The three denominations that share custody of the Holy Sepulchre found rare agreement on one point. The sacred nature of the site required that investigation proceed with appropriate reverence and control. Early Christian historians took a firmer stance. Many argued the discoveries restored credibility to traditions that modern skepticism had dismissed as legend. For decades, scholars treated the Holy Sepulchre as pious fiction. One historian noted in a confidential memo that later circulated widely, "This evidence forces a fundamental reassessment. The physical reality matches the textual accounts too precisely to ignore." Material scientists added technical weight to the discussion. Their analysis of mineral formations inside the sealed chamber showed patterns consistent with first-century deposition. No later disturbance could be detected, supporting claims that the space had remained closed since antiquity. These findings strengthened arguments that the chamber represented genuine ancient remains rather than medieval constructions or later modifications. Media coverage amplified the controversy. Headlines ranged from breathless declarations that Jesus' tomb had been proven real to skeptical dismissals that nothing had actually changed. Both extremes missed the nuanced reality. What had been discovered wasn't proof of resurrection. Science cannot measure such things. What had been discovered was proof of remarkable alignment between archaeological evidence and historical texts, in ways that couldn't easily be explained away. The discoveries also reignited debates about other claimed burial sites. The Garden Tomb, popular with Protestant pilgrims, dated to the Iron Age, 700 years too early. The Talpiot Tomb, despite sensational claims in a 2007 documentary, showed no credible connection to Jesus of Nazareth. The Holy Sepulchre's evidence stood in stark contrast. Layer upon layer of verifiable, datable, contextually appropriate findings that aligned with every detail early sources provided. Even skeptical scholars acknowledged the significance. "If grudgingly, we may never achieve absolute certainty," wrote Dan Bahat, former city archaeologist of Jerusalem. "But we have no other site that can lay claim as weighty as this one, and we have no good reason to reject its authenticity." What lies beneath? The burial bed was carefully documented, measured with precision, photographed from every angle. Then, following the original agreement, the marble covering was replaced. The chamber beneath remains sealed. The garden soil has been protected. The linen traces have been preserved in laboratory storage. Professor Antonia Moropoulou, who supervised the restoration, emphasized the finality of the closure. "The architectural conservation we are implementing is intended to last forever. The site will not be opened again in this generation, possibly not for centuries." But before the marble was replaced, every surface was mapped with technology that didn't exist when the tomb was last exposed. High-resolution 3D scans captured details invisible to the naked eye. Photogrammetry created models accurate to the millimeter. Chemical analysis identified compounds that tell stories about ancient practices. This documentation represents a complete scientific record of a site that billions of people consider sacred but few have ever truly seen. Martin Biddle, whose 1999 study remains the definitive archaeological examination of the Holy Sepulchre, believes the key to understanding the site lies in details yet to be fully explored. The surfaces of the rock must be examined minutely for traces of graffiti. He emphasized, "We know there are at least 6 other rock-cut tombs beneath various parts of the church. Why did Bishop Macarius identify this tomb as Christ's tomb? He doesn't say, and we don't know, but there probably is evidence if only it is looked for." The question haunts the investigation. What convinced Constantine's team, in 325 CE, that this specific tomb among many was the one they sought? The answer may lie in markings so faint they were overlooked, in symbols carved by early Christians who visited the site before it was buried under Hadrian's temple, in graffiti that identified this space as sacred before any church existed. These traces, if they survive, would provide the final link between the physical structure and the specific event it commemorates. For now, they remain hidden, waiting beneath marble, waiting for technology advanced enough to read what time has nearly erased, waiting for a moment when the 3 custodian churches agree, once again, to allow science to look. Until then, the discoveries already made stand as testament to something remarkable, whether viewed through the lens of faith or the scrutiny of science. The evidence beneath Jerusalem's most sacred Christian site tells a story that's harder to dismiss than many expected. A garden grew where the Gospels said it did. A tomb was carved where tradition claimed it was. Burial practices matched what ancient sources described. And beneath it all, a sealed chamber waited in darkness for nearly 2,000 years. The stones remain. The evidence is documented. The questions linger. And deep beneath Jerusalem's ancient streets, Beneath marble and mortar and the weight of centuries, the earth still holds secrets it has not yet revealed. What do you think these discoveries mean? Do they strengthen the historical basis of the gospel accounts? Or do they simply confirm that early Christians accurately remembered the burial practices and locations of their time? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to stay informed as new evidence emerges from one of history's most scrutinized sites. The story of what lies beneath Jesus' tomb is far from over. More discoveries may be waiting, and when they surface, you'll want to know what they found.